The doctor told me that I had 3 months to live. It was easy to believe his words. My body was weakened, my strength was failing, and every minute seemed like an eternity. And then my husband, James, came in. He stood before me in our luxurious home, his face as calm as ever, but in his eyes I saw something new, cold, calculating. "You realize I need your inheritance right now?" he said, his voice smooth, but there was a certain insistence in it. I couldn't believe my ears. He was saying it like it was money he just had to take. All the years we'd been together seemed empty and meaningless now. He was always there for me, but I never felt like he really cared. I was too young when I met him. Certain that it was love, I didn't notice how he was slowly taking everything, my freedom, my dreams, my life. But now it was all so obvious. The world was blurring in my eyes, and I felt the champagne glass slip from my hand as my body began to heavy with despair. I took a gulp of air, and everything around me went dark. James looked at me, his eyes filled with cold satisfaction. I already knew that I wasn't just dying. I was dying because of him. He knew that no one could save me. I was in pain, but that pain was probably the only real feeling I'd had in recent years. I lay on the cold marble floor, feeling no more pain or fear, and for a moment as the darkness enveloped me, I thought that all I'd been through wasn't worth it. 10 years in this marriage, 10 years of lies, manipulation, and pain. I felt sorry for myself, but at some point I accepted that this was the end. I opened my eyes, but not in cold darkness as I expected. My body felt fresh and light, as if I had woken up after a long sleep. Instead of the gray walls of the room, I was revealed to a familiar ceiling, the one I'd seen as a child when I was lying in my bedroom. The dark stars I'd glued on the walls glowed in the darkness, and it was both strange and comfortable. My heart almost stopped when I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I was a 17-year-old girl, the same one who'd met him for the first time, with awkward bangs and fair skin, no trace of the pain and fear I'd accumulated over the past 10 years. My gaze flicked to the phone that lay on the table next to me. It was a date I had no way of forgetting, the day I'd first met James in high school. It was unbelievable. I sat there stunned, but at the same time realizing with each new moment that I was back. This was the second chance I had gotten. This time, I definitely wasn't going to let him ruin my life. My school uniform hung on the door, as if no one was ever going to remove it. I felt a strange warmth as I stroked the fabric. My heart filled with a new determination. I will take control of my destiny. I will no longer be that naive little girl who believed in love and happiness until everything was destroyed. I now have the knowledge and experience that can change the future. I squeezed my eyes shut, but a memory flashed before my eyes. I saw James on the horizon where that old school had been, and for the first time since I'd met him, I didn't want to see him. I remembered that this guy, who had once seemed perfect to me, was just a dangerous mask. As I stood in front of the mirror trying to realize what was happening, my little sister Laura flew into my room. Her hair was gathered into 2 ponytails and her eyes were shining. Full of energy as always, she slammed the door shut and jumped onto my bed, pushing all doubt out of my mind. "Sarah, are you ready? We're not going to be late for school, are we?" Her words were full of nonchalance as if nothing had changed, but I knew everything had changed. I hugged her tightly, feeling the tears begin to rise in my throat. In that moment, as I held Laura in my arms, I realized that in this life she was still here, that she wasn't dead like she was in that one. That day, a few years later, Laura died in a car accident, the very day Graham offered to let me move into his house. That tragic event had left a void in my soul, but now here I stood, with Laura in my arms, alive, full of hope, and I was determined not to let it happen again. I followed her gaze as she ran out of the room. My parents aren't ruined yet. Not ruined the way they were in my previous life. Mom wasn't hiding from the world in a bottle of wine yet, and Dad hadn't yet decided on a desperate act. It was strange, like everything was as it should be. Mom and Dad were arguing in the kitchen, as they always did, about who forgot to buy the milk, about why Dad had started drinking too much coffee in the morning again. I watched them, and in that moment, it seemed like everything in the world fell into place. Laura and I walked to school, and as we walked down those familiar streets, I felt nostalgia overwhelm me. We passed the cafe where I had first met Graham. The memory of him came back hauntingly. This place was as meaningful to us as any other. The park where he first told me he wanted to marry me, the bank where he made me sign papers, devastating my life. Those places didn't seem so evil at the time. I had been blind then, willing to believe in an illusion, but now I knew they were just stages in his plan to destroy me. When I walked into the school, I saw my old friend, Karen, who used to try to warn me about Graham. She had almost disappeared from my life, and I hadn't listened to her then. But now, this time, I'm definitely not going to make those mistakes again. When Karen came up to me, she looked a little tense, but still tried to smile. "You're here again?" she asked, slightly surprised. I nodded, in response to which she frowned, as if she noticed something in my gaze. I could see that she was trying not to give away her real feelings, trying to keep her thoughts private, but I knew they would all come to the surface again. "He's trying to influence you again, isn't he?" she asked, her voice quiet and wary. I forced myself to smile. "No, Karen, I'll be more careful this time." I turned to her and pointed to the table where the paperwork about my future lay. Nothing was left to chance. I was now in control of my life. As I woke up, I felt a strange sensation, as if I was in another world, a world where I could be young again, and where disappointment and pain were not yet present. My body felt different, light, full of energy, as if I was once again the girl I had once been when everything had just begun. I was sitting in my room, the very place where once as a teenager I had experienced every little thing with incredible passion and confidence that the world was open before me. My room looked exactly the same as it did then. Old posters, a shelf of books, star-shaped stickers on the walls. Everything was just as it had been before. But there was a hurricane raging inside me that wouldn't let me believe I wasn't wrong. When I looked at my phone, I froze. The date. It was too much. I looked again. It seemed to be the exact day, August 15th, and everything around me suddenly felt more real than ever before. That day was the beginning of my history with James. It was then, that day, that I first met him, and everything changed. I wanted to believe that I could make a difference, that a second chance was an opportunity to start from scratch. My mind was a mix of joy, anxiety, hope, and fear. I clenched my eyes shut, and for a moment it seemed as if the past and present were intertwined. I was ready to do things differently. I got out of bed, and my gaze turned to the mirror again. I looked at myself, but it wasn't just a reflection. It was me, but different. My hair, my eyes, my face, everything was the same as before, but now I knew the world wouldn't be the same. I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of joy, but rather of confidence that now I would definitely not let history repeat itself. My gaze fell on the papers on the table. They were the very papers that I had signed then, almost without a second thought, everything about my future. The very papers that had changed my life, giving me the world but taking away everything that was important. I couldn't believe that I had that chance in my hands again. What if I could go back and change everything? What if I could tell myself to be strong? But now, instead of letting the past control my destiny, I knew I would be in control of this future myself. The moment I looked back, the door to my room swung open and Laura, my little sister, flew in. She was the same as always, with pigtails, a bright smile, and a restless energy. She walked up to me and said with a smile on her face, "Are you ready, Sarah? We won't be late for school." I couldn't contain my laughter because in that moment everything seemed so familiar, and at the same time, I realized that this day was the beginning of a new journey. I hugged Laura tightly, feeling the lump in my throat rise. Laura was alive. My sister that I had lost in that life, in that terrible car accident, was now by my side. I couldn't believe I was holding her in my arms again. She and I grew up together. She was a part of my whole world, but she was gone in the past. And now, coming back here, I realized that I was willing to do anything to make sure that didn't happen. Laura left the room, and I stood at the window and watched her disappear out the door for a long time. Parallel to all these thoughts, memories of my parents' suffering also came into my mind. Mom, consumed with guilt and regret, and Dad, who had lost everything, including his life, the moment Graham destroyed our family. My parents were disillusioned with life, but they weren't broken yet. It was amazing to me because in that life, there was nothing I could do to save them. But now it was different. They were whole, alive, and I was ready to protect them. As Laura and I walked toward school, the world around me seemed both familiar and foreign at the same time. Every street, every turn, it was all familiar. But now that I knew this path could be changed, I began to see everything completely differently. We passed the very cafe where I'd met Graham. The memory of him came flooding back, and I stopped involuntarily. How strange that this was where it had all started. How truly he had come into my life. That day I was young, naive, and full of hope. But it all turned out to be just a game in which I was a pawn. Now as I walked by, I couldn't help but remember how Graham had courted me, how everything had seemed so perfect. His smile, his words, it all seemed so pure, so harmless. But it was only an outer covering for what was really lurking inside. He knew how to make me believe in him, how to manipulate my feelings. He took everything I cared about and left me in a void. This time I decided not to give him a chance to come into my life again. We continued walking, and I noticed Laura saying something, but at that moment I was too absorbed in my thoughts. Images of the past came to mind, places that now seemed like traps, all the people who had once been there and were now gone. But one thought made me happy. I was alive again. I could once again take part in my own life. When we finally reached the school gate, I saw a familiar figure, Karen, my old friend who, in a previous life, had tried to warn me about Graham. I remembered how she had tried to tell me the truth, how she had warned me, but I had been blind. Our eyes met, and I noticed that her expression was wary, as if she sensed something. I walked over to her and smiled. "Sarah, are you here again?" she asked, somehow unsure. I nodded, but in the back of my mind I felt excitement overwhelm me. I knew things would be different now. I wouldn't let myself be deceived again. I told her, "Yes, Karen, I'm here, and this time it's going to be different." She frowned slightly, but then sighed. "I thought you'd have gotten too involved by now to change things, but you can, can't you?" There wasn't just a question in her voice, but a genuine plea. I knew she wanted to help, and this was my opportunity to not only get my life back, but to get back everything I'd lost. I felt confident again. This time, I would be proactive. After Karen stepped away, I felt a strange tension. This wasn't just the first day of school, it was the first day of a new life. And I had to be ready. I was no longer that naive girl who blindly believed in people's good intentions. I had a plan, and I was going to stick to it. School was the same as before, but now I saw it through the eyes of someone who knew what was coming next. I knew that if I wasn't careful, things could go back to the way they were before. Graham, he was dangerous. He was smart and calculating, and I knew his eyes were already watching me, searching for weaknesses. My heart raced when I saw him at the school gates. He was so young, so handsome, everything as it was 10 years ago. He smiled at me, and I felt something inside me clench. His smile was so familiar, so alluring. But now I knew it was just a calculation. I, like everyone else, was just a step on the way to his goal. But this time, I would not be such an easy target. I felt my whole body tense up. There shouldn't be the slightest doubt. I must not fall for his games. He looked in my direction again and waved his hand, but I didn't respond. My eyes didn't flinch, and I felt him freeze for a moment. He hadn't expected this from me. I was relieved. In that moment, I realized I wasn't the same person I was before. I was stronger. When I walked out of school, the air was filled with the smell of fresh leaves. But there was something about the day that didn't feel right. I couldn't shake the feeling that something important was slipping away from me again. Karen's voice echoed in my head as she told me that Graham wasn't just a guy, but an elaborate game, and that he would ruin everything if I let him. I knew I had to be careful. He was an overarching shadow in my life. His influence was everywhere, even in places I didn't expect to see it. I was walking down the street, and it was like I was surrounded by walls I hadn't seen before. Do you know what that's like? When you realize for the first time that your life is not just an accident, but a carefully constructed construct full of traps and betrayals. I remembered the day it all started. I was blind. I didn't see how Graham had begun to work his way through my life. I thought it was just love, but now I realized it had been a game from the beginning. I saw Laura walking ahead of me, chatting about something about schoolwork. She was so alive, so vibrant, and I could feel the guilt of everything that had happened overwhelm me with every step. I couldn't let her die like it had happened in the other reality. I couldn't let it happen again. As we approached the house, I saw my father standing on the doorstep. He looked the same as before, firm and confident. There was no trace in his eyes of the despair I remembered from another life, when he had been victimized by other people's ambitions. Dad was alive, and I knew that now, in this moment, I had a chance to save him, to save our family from the destruction Graham and his clan were preparing for us. But there was bitterness in that, too. I needed to be strong for myself and for everyone around me. I walked into the house and felt a little lost. The moment I closed the door behind me, everything was back to normal. We were all together, and I realized I could stop it. I could break free from this nightmare they had built for me. I could bring my family back to a reality where it was still intact. As I sat down to dinner that evening, the thoughts never left me. I played with the fork in my hand, unable to focus on the words of my parents who were discussing something unimportant. Mom was still talking about her new hobby, yoga, and Dad was once again complaining about his morning coffee addiction. But there was something soothing about these conversations, something I hadn't felt in so long. I wanted those moments to stay like that forever. Suddenly, my phone vibrated on the table. I looked at the screen and saw a message from Karen. Her text was brief but full of anxiety. "He's flirting again. Be careful." I froze for a moment. Graham wasn't just in my life. He was part of all my plans, and I realized that if I wasn't careful, he'd become a major threat again. He was calculating, smart, and always knew how to approach from the right angle, how to make me believe he was on my side. I put the phone down on the table, continuing to look at my family, but now my mind was only on how to proceed. I could feel the tension growing with each passing moment. I had to do something, and that something couldn't be on the level of just defending myself. I had to beat him at his own game. Karen wrote again, "He's not just with you out of love. He's counting on your weakness. Be prepared." I could see the warning in those words, and it made me feel something slipping out of my control. I couldn't let him get the upper hand again. This time, I would be one step ahead. The next morning, as I left the house, I was tormented by conflicting feelings. I knew it was going to be a tough day, a day where I would be deciding what to do with what I had just learned and what I would have to do. My mind was filled with plans, thoughts of how to stop Graham, how to uncover his intentions and keep him from destroying everything I was trying to build. I paced down the street, feeling every detail of this morning, every movement, as if the world itself was telling me how to proceed. It was cold outside, but that cold reminded me that I was no longer afraid. I felt my every movement growing more and more confident. In the past, I would have been scared. I would have thought of the consequences, of the fact that if I did something wrong, things could go wrong again. But now I knew I had to follow through. I had a chance to take back control. I had a chance to turn things around. I walked up to the school and noticed that Graham was already standing at the door. His gaze was so focused that I could have sworn he knew I wasn't the same as before. He could see that I was different, that this time I wasn't going to let him play with me like he had before. He looked at me as if he wanted to see the old naivety in my eyes, but instead he found a determination he'd never seen in my life. I walked past him without a glance in his direction. I felt his eyes, but they didn't strike fear in me now. I knew that he no longer controlled me. I was now in control of my own destiny. The moment I stepped past him seemed familiar. He always met me at the door, and I always stopped, losing myself in his gaze. But this time I didn't stop. I wasn't just confident. I was ready to finally get rid of this poison in my life. The school day passed me by like a blur. I listened to the teachers, but my thoughts were elsewhere. I mentally replayed every moment, every event that had brought me here. I realized that I would need to prepare myself for the crucial step. I had to be prepared not just for an open confrontation, but to be ready for the game I had to win. After school, I met up with Karen at the coffee shop where she always liked to sit. We didn't socialize like we used to, but now our conversations were more serious. She knew what was going on, and I knew she would be my ally in this. We sat around the table and discussed what I should do about Graham, about his family, about his plans. "You realize that Graham is there for a reason you're around, don't you?" she asked. I nodded, not needing any further words. I knew she was right. He was part of this game, but I couldn't let him win. "Something has to be done about it," I said, clutching my cup confidently. "I know he's watching me, that he's waiting for my weakness, but I won't give him the chance." Karen looked at me with recognition. She realized what I had decided. That was the moment I became ready for the final battle. We talked for a long time, discussing every step, every detail, until I had a clear plan in my head. Karen was helping me, telling me what to do. She knew how to work with information, how to strategize. Together we could defeat him. I was ready to act, and nothing could stop me now. After I met Karen, my sense of time became even more compressed. Every morning, every evening was now important. We were going to act, and I realized I could no longer afford to make a single mistake. Memories of how it had all started came to mind. Graham, his wonderful smile, his jokes that I thought were so real. But now I knew there was something much more dangerous behind it all. He wasn't just an attractive young man, he was a master manipulator, and I was his victim. But now I was ready to get my life back. Every morning I felt my nerves strain to the limit, and how every step brought me closer to the moment when everything would change. I was on my way to school, but my thoughts were not at all about school subjects. My goal was clear. I had to find a way to bring Graham out into the open, to destroy his plans, to make his influence no longer so strong. And to do that, I had to learn more. I had to become his mirror, reflecting his manipulations, his weaknesses. School seemed the same as before, but I no longer saw it as a place where I could just learn. It was the arena in which I was to fight for my freedom. I watched Graham's every move, his conversations, his gaze, which now couldn't hide the cruelty that lurked beneath his exterior. He knew I wasn't the same person I'd been before, but he still didn't know that I was ready to strike. Once in the hallway of the school, I accidentally bumped into Laura. She was standing at the door with her friends and laughing. I felt something warm encompass my heart. She was safe. She was alive. And in that moment, I realized it was all for her. I couldn't let those creeps take her away like they had in that past. I smiled at her and gave her a quick hug before walking away. I don't know if she felt anything weird about it, but in that moment I realized that I was willing to do anything to keep her in my life. I would not let things go down the same path again. After school, I met up with Karen. We found a quiet cafe where no one who could hear us wandered in. I was tense, but there was no limit to my determination. We discussed what to do next, how to prepare for Graham no longer being able to manipulate my decisions. "Are you really sure you want to do this?" Karen asked, looking at me with concern and caution. I nodded. With each passing day, I was becoming more and more confident that I had a chance to change the course of events. This plan wasn't just vindictive, it was important to protect my family, to regain everything we had lost to Graham and his family. I told Karen that I had been watching him, that I was already ready to reveal his secrets. He didn't know that I'd been studying his every move, that I'd figured it all out. He thought I would be as helpless and naive as before, but now I realized how he was playing on my feelings and weaknesses. Karen looked at me with respect and understanding. "You're going to do the right thing. I'll be right by your side," she said, and I felt my resolve strengthen. We began to make a plan of action. We knew we needed to work in the shadows so Graham wouldn't notice his game was exposed. At this point, it became clear to me that no move would be random. Every action would be designed to disrupt his plan, and I would be ready to face him head on. The next few days were like a fine line between caution and desperation. I realized that I was on the verge of revealing everything Graham was hiding. He could already sense that I suspected something, and his demeanor became a little more tense. He had even tried to approach me a few times, asking questions that would have been invisible before. But now I knew that all this talk was just another way of manipulation. His invisible hand was reaching for me, but I was ready to fight. I wasn't going to be another victim of his intricacies. I watched him closely. His every move, his every word that had seemed harmless before, I now saw as part of a more complex game. I caught his every glance and listened intently to his every word. But the more I studied him, the more I sensed that he was becoming only a pathetic representative of a much larger, hidden power. I began to realize that Graham was just a pawn in some great and terrible game, and his family, his relatives, were the ones behind all his actions. And in that moment, I realized that all this time, I hadn't just been his target. I was part of his plan. My family was his family's target, and all of this manipulation was designed to destroy us from the inside out. Realizing this was a shock, but also a revelation. I couldn't let this continue. I was willing to do anything to protect those I cared about. I met with Karen that evening to discuss next steps. We sat in one of the secluded corners of the cafe, which was always empty at this time. Karen excitedly told me that she had learned something new about the Graham family. It turned out that they had been planning for Graham and me to marry for a long time, hoping to combine two powerful businesses. I felt my heart beat faster. This was the moment of truth. I had to act before it was too late. We decided that this time I wouldn't act covertly. I had to force him to reveal himself openly. I could no longer hide my intentions. I sent Graham a text message. His eyes sparkled when he received it, and I could see his face become a little tense. He answered me with the same smile that had once led me on, but it didn't seem so confident now. "Sarah, you look like you're about to break up this whole relationship we've been building," he wrote. There was so much falseness in his words that it made me feel a little better. He didn't know yet that I had already pulled him off the grid, and he was the last person to know that the game was over. I answered him with one short word: "Come over." When I got home, I felt the whole house get really heavy. The waiting before meeting Graham was becoming unbearable. My parents were sitting around the table again, talking about trivial things, and Laura was trying to talk me into going to the park with her. But at this point, I couldn't think about anything else. I had to get it over with. Graham came in the evening as arranged. He looked as he always did, confident and at ease, but now I could see his gaze waver slightly when he saw me. We sat in the hall, and his questions became more and more intrusive. I felt my confidence grow stronger. I wasn't going to let him manipulate my decisions again. I knew this time would be different. The day came when I finally made my decision. My whole life, everything I once thought was important, was on the precipice, and I was ready to take the final step to change everything. Meeting Graham had become inevitable. It wasn't just an explanation. It was a collision of two worlds, two destinies. I'd been preparing for this moment for weeks, thinking over every detail, every word. I couldn't make a mistake. This time, I wouldn't let him get away with it without consequences. Graham, as always, arrived at the exact moment we'd agreed. He stood at the door, his usual confident gait, his gaze full of the same invisible control he always used. I could see him trying to remain calm, but his eyes betrayed anxiety. He knew I wasn't the same person I used to be. In his world, where he was always one step ahead, I was the element he couldn't control. But that had changed now. I had taken that control into my own hands. We sat in silence. I could hear his breathing becoming a little more shallow as he tried to figure out what was going on and why things hadn't gone the way he'd planned. I looked up at him, and his eyes didn't have the confidence in them that he usually greeted me with. I knew this was his last chance. He was sure that I hadn't yet realized what was really going on, that I hadn't seen his true intentions, but I did. I knew he was behind everything that had ruined my life. And now I was ready to stop him. "Graham, did you think I would be afraid? You were wrong," I said, my voice harder than ever before. He couldn't believe his ears. His gaze had changed, becoming harder, but there was still uncertainty in it. He was trying to manipulate the situation, trying to regain control. But I was no longer the naive girl who believed what he said. I met his gaze and felt something inside me freeze. We both knew that this was the moment when everything was decided. I had made my choice, and now I was ready to shatter his world. Graham opened his mouth, trying to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. I stared at him with cold determination, not giving him the slightest chance to manipulate me. All of his devious attempts had been exposed. I realized that this wasn't just a fight for me. It was a fight to stop the destructive plans he was about to carry out. And more importantly, it was a fight for my family, for Laura, for those around me who couldn't be part of his game. "You don't understand, Sarah. You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, trying to regain his usual confidence. But his voice no longer had the power he used to use to make me doubt. He knew I could see right through him. He wasn't the man he was trying to appear to be. I learned about his family, how they manipulated people, how they destroyed everything in their path for their own gain. I got up from my seat and slowly walked over to him. "You forget that I know how to play this game too. You can't control me, Graham. You can't make me believe your false promises. I know what you want, but you won't get it." "Not this time," I said, and there was not only determination in my words, but undeniable truth. His face turned pale and he took a step back. I felt the ground beneath him begin to crumble. He realized he could no longer be the master of this game. I was no longer his victim, and that was the biggest blow to him. I knew I had to act. I had proof. I had information. Now I needed to bring it all to light, to break his web of lies and manipulation. The moment Graham took a step back, I felt the control begin to shift to me. His confidence, his manipulations, his usual game, all of it, was no longer working. I was now the one who was setting the rules of the game. He froze, and I saw his face contort with bewilderment and confusion. He couldn't understand what had happened. I was the girl he believed he could control, and I was the one who could ruin all his plans. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. He wasn't ready to admit defeat, and I knew he would do anything to maintain his power. But in that moment, I felt stronger than ever. I realized that my determination was the only thing I needed to win. Now I knew what I needed to do. I needed to take everything he thought was his from him and show him that his manipulations were no longer valid. "You were wrong, Graham. You thought you could break me, but you didn't know I was strong all along. You didn't know I had a strength that was stronger than your lies," I said. His eyes darkened, and I felt his anger begin to grow. But now I wasn't afraid of it. Now I was ready for his reaction. He pulled himself together quickly, and his face became cold and calculating again. He tried to regain his power, but I was no longer giving in. I knew he wouldn't stop, and I had to be ready for anything. In his eyes, I saw insecurity, but I also saw aggression. This was the moment he was trying to take control back, but I wasn't going to let him. "You're not going to beat me," he said through clenched teeth. I replied, "I've already won." And it wasn't just a statement. It was a promise. I knew what I had to do to break his web, to rip him out of this world of manipulation and lies he lived in. The realization that I was no longer afraid gave me strength. I couldn't let Graham put things back the way he wanted them. I knew it was time to reveal the cards and destroy his plans before he could realize them. He stood in front of me, still trying to hold on to his power, but I was ready to shatter his beliefs. He didn't realize that for me, this wasn't just revenge. This was justice being served. This was the moment I had to declare that I would no longer be his victim. "You think your secrets stay in the shadows? That you control everything?" I asked. Graham clenched his jaw, but I could already see his confidence starting to fade. I knew panic was awakening in him. He realized that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse, that I had found a way to break his nets, and it was unbearable for him. I took a step toward him, and now, when I looked into his eyes, I no longer saw in them what had once attracted me. Now all I saw was emptiness and fear. He stood before me like a man who had lost everything, and that was the moment I realized that I had won. I was ready to take what I owned and destroy everything he had built on lies and manipulation. I was ready for the next step that was going to end this game. I knew that once I showed everyone the truth, his web of lies would collapse, and he would no longer be able to manipulate me or my family. All that was left was to bring him to the revelation by destroying his image. The moment I took the final step, the moment I fully realized my power and control over the situation, it felt like the whole world stopped. Graham was in front of me, but he was no longer the man who had once been the center of my world. His confidence, his manipulations, his devious games, all of that was now shattered. I knew in that moment he could feel his power slipping away. He was still standing, trying to appear calm, but I could see his hands trembling slightly, his eyes running nervously, trying to find a way out. But there was no way. He could win now. I had taken his weapon from him, and now that I was standing in front of him, I felt more confident than ever before. "You thought you could manipulate me." I hadn't expected my words to sound so firm. There was something undeniable in the way they sounded, like a law he had to accept. Graham tried to answer, but his words stuck in his throat. He was caught in his own net. I looked at him with a calmness I hadn't had before. He was shattered. I could see it in his face, in the way he was beginning to realize his world was crumbling. But I couldn't stop. It was a moment of truth. This moment was the culmination of everything I'd experienced, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. Graham, of course, was trying to maintain his usual confidence, but his words sounded weak, almost powerless. He was still the man trying to save face, but I could already see that his strength was running out. "You can't do this, Sarah. You don't realize what you're doing." His voice shook. I knew he realized he was no longer in control. He was trying to save himself, but it was too late. My gaze met his, and I felt something heavy that had been hanging in the air finally fall. It was freedom. Freedom from his manipulations. Freedom from his false promises. I could no longer be a part of his game. In that moment, I was ready to destroy all the plans he'd made for so long. My voice was cold but firm. "You have lost, Graham. Now all your lodges will crumble." I could feel the ground beneath my feet begin to crumble, and I was ready to face this moment like a victor. Graham stood in front of me, but no longer had the power he used to manipulate my every move. I could see his confidence fading, and everything he'd tried to hide was coming out. He knew he couldn't hide his lies now. He couldn't control me or my life anymore. I was ready to tear down all his nets, to rip him out of the world he had created for himself and for me. "You think I'm afraid of losing everything? You're wrong. You're the one who's lost everything," I said, and there was determination in my words, but also freedom. Freedom from his games, freedom from his deception. I wasn't going to stand still while he ruined my life. I was now ready to reclaim everything he had taken, and more than that, I was ready to fight for the ones I loved. In that moment, as his face grew more and more tense, I felt my confidence rise. I was no longer someone who could believe his lies, who could doubt my right to happiness and freedom. I knew that he could no longer control me, and that was perhaps the most powerful moment of our encounter. His desire to manipulate me now seemed insignificant. He was just a man who had failed to realize that I would not let him be the winner this time. In that moment, I felt no fear, no resentment, only determination. I was ready to destroy him, and with him all his plans. I knew that his dark web, his lies and manipulations, would no longer be able to destroy my life. I had wrested that control from him, and now I was ready to show the world who I had become. The moment I took the last step and watched Graham lose his confidence, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. I'm not afraid of his threats. I'm not afraid of his manipulations. I'm not afraid of losing what I once held dear. All these years, I had carried the weight of his lies, his deceit, but now it was all behind me. I stood in front of him and felt like I was freeing myself from all that weight, like I was shedding the weight that had been dragging me down all these years. Graham tried to regain control, but his words now seemed as empty as the wind. He didn't know what to do because I was no longer the kind of girl he could easily break. I had learned to fight, learned to see people for who they really were. And now, as I stood before him, I realized I had won. His manipulations could no longer control my life. I felt something inside me snap. It was a victory, but I knew I couldn't stop. I couldn't just let go and let him get away again. My hands were shaking, but I held myself together. This wasn't just the end of this episode. This was a new phase in my life, and I was going to take full control of my future. You thought you were in control of everything, but all this time I was the one in control, I said, and it was true. I was free from all the shackles he had tried to put on me. Now I could do anything I wanted to do. I had a future, and I was going to pursue it with full determination. Graham stood in front of me, realizing my impossibility. I knew that his world, his life would crumble right before his eyes, and when he looked at me one last time, I saw the uncertainty in his eyes. He couldn't understand how this had happened. He was defeated, not only by me, but by his own game. I no longer felt anger. I no longer felt resentment. I felt only release and calmness. All that was left now was to turn the page and start a new chapter. I turned and walked towards the exit. My step was firm and my breathing steady. I didn't look back. I didn't need to look at him anymore. All I needed was to leave him behind. In that moment, as I stepped away from his shattered world, I realized that not only had I won this battle, I had won my freedom, I had won my life back, I had won back the right to my destiny, to my choices. I knew there would be many challenges ahead, but now I was ready for them. I was ready to become the person I had always wanted to be. Walking through the dark streets, I could feel life coming back to me. I was myself again. I wasn't a broken woman who had lost everything. I was a woman who had won. And despite everything that had happened, I knew one thing. The future was now in my hands. Laura was waiting for me at home. And when I returned, she greeted me with the same carefree smile that had always warmed my heart. I hugged her tighter than I had ever hugged her before. She was safe. My family was safe. And now I could be sure that no one else would be able to destroy our world. I looked out the window, where the evening light was falling softly onto the streets, and I realized that this world was mine now. I would do anything to restore people's trust so that everyone who had been hurt could find their place. And despite all the trials, I realized that the most important thing was not a victory over those who tried to destroy us. It was victory over myself, over my weakness, over my fear. And now I was ready for the next chapter of my life, because now I knew I am not a victim, I am a victor.